in the spirit of the chaotic times we find ourselves in, I totally changed the name of my talk tonight. And I sort of plan to talk through the notion of disruption and how it is something to adopt, to put us all in the best possible, give us the best possible tools for dealing with the chaotic times we're in. So I find myself sort of in an intersection in that I was born not far from here in Borneo. Lived in Indonesia till I was 7. My father is an engineer. My brother, Jonathan McDowell, is an architect. I'm the black sheep, sort of fallen into media space. But I think that I will try and sort of pull that all back together again as well. So this quote by Buckminster Fuller has been engaging me in the last short while, really to drill down into the things that we have to do, not to just roll forward from what we know and from tradition, but to do some radical change in what we're developing. You never change things by fighting existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So my career and sort of my accidental path to where I am now started when a young man walked in off the street in London to the art school, Central School of Art, where I was studying painting, and I was also booking bands, and asked me if I wanted a band to play for free tomorrow night, mate. So I, of course, said yes, and it turned out to be the Sex Pistols' first gig. At that point, my life changed pretty dramatically, and I really took on board the ethos of that punk time when everything was up in the air. There was really no solid ground. I also want to talk about this sense that I think this sense of change that we're in, based on the narrative technologies that we have available to us now, that we've come somehow full circle. We started off telling stories in a tribal sense in order to make sense of the world, and in order to establish rules that could be passed from generation to generation. We built stories collaboratively, developed narratives over, hundreds and thousands of years sometimes. And then I'll do a very potted history of the change that occurred when the printing press was invented. And we moved from this sort of mythological, global, tribal storytelling into a storytelling of a single author. And everything we know for the past centuries has really been based around the idea of single authorship. Whether it's, now sort of the architect or the director or the auteur, cinema director, or the artist, and the author of the book, all of those different media forms have moved forward with the notion that we listen to a single author, and the author has control of the viewer's gaze. What happened in media really 20, 25 years ago, but it's really now cementing with interactive media and the transition into the mixed reality, virtual reality, or augmented reality, is that the author has kind of lost control of that viewer's gaze. We're now entering this realm of 360-degree storytelling in the media space, and we're beginning to sort of bring ourselves back into this relationship to the real world with respect to our tribe, and the notion that we are, through all of these different media spaces, kind of back into a tribal storytelling. So my practice now of world building is trying to really address how you look at the 360 degree of the storytelling of the narrative space and combine that with what I would call now the post-cinematic, and give ourselves a kind of new start to the way that we negotiate our environment. So story, I think every story ever told has been told to make sense of the world around us as human, as a human at the center. So I believe every story ever told has also been made up of these three components of a character in an environment, or multiple characters in multiple environments, and a human viewpoint, the viewpoint that allows us to enter that world space. Now, for myself, when I entered the film industry, I was joining that tradition of a single author, linear, industrial, really a Victorian model that I think we are all familiar with in our different industries. Where in film we would start with a script that would be funded, that would have a producer attached and then a director, and the director would fire the first writer and hire another writer, and then hire the designer, and one moves into construction, and then a cinematographer comes in this linear process and changes the components of the environment so that the light goes where he wants it, and then the actors come in and they don't have a door where they want it, so they cut the door in a wall that wasn't intended, and then you rehearse and the camera moves in and you shoot, and you move out into post-production, into finishing, and distribute out into the audience. Up until 1999, I started in the film industry in 1980. So from then till 1999, that was the process I was familiar with, as we all were. And then something fairly dramatically changed for me, again, sort of accidentally, and the model changed between 1999. That linear model changed into something that was really completely nonlinear, based on a digital structure, digital framework, and really representing a kind of new holistic way to work. What this represents is the notion that rather than having a script or a brief at the center, there's a narrative container, a sort of notion of story at the beginning of the inceptive process. And that inceptive process moves into a design visualization phase, which includes the inceptive idea, a really substantial amount of time spent in a prototyping space, which has been enabled by these tools, these 3D tools that allow us to combine scale, environment, the human figure, and the camera or the viewpoint in a single relationship. So into that model of the story, we can actually enter, we can share, we can collaborate within that single space. So these radial lines represent crafts that would have been distributed through the linear system, and to whom would the sort of central idea would have been passed through. These crafts now all have access to the center idea. This is applicable across all of our design industries, I would suggest. That design visualization process turns into something that in film we would call pre-visualization, where the narrative actually starts to become prototyped itself. So what we would have known as storyboards becomes something that is sort of animated and starts describing the narrative very specifically, again with the character moving through the environment. And then you move into a phase that we might call capture, where we're actually starting to nail down that narrative and then finishing it. So as that story in the center resolves through this design visualization, this process of more and more crafts joining the common collaborative space, so the narrative resolves into story, the story resolves into script, and you end up with, all things being equal, a natural evolution, a holistic narrative. So this model came out of a film that I was fortunate to be asked to join called Minority Report. And the day that the film started was the day that I was hired was the day that the writer was hired. So there was no possibility of there being a script in place or doing the normal thing that one would do of breaking down the brief, as it were, and turning it into executables, if that's a word. Instead, we were faced with the notion that we would have to create a world within which the story would find a place. So we knew very little at the beginning of this film process. We knew that we were in Washington, D.C. We knew that it was the year 2050. We knew that there were disruptors at the core, these precogs. For those of you who have not seen the film, 3 precognitive beings who can predict murder and violent crime and have created a vast influx of population into the city center. We knew that Washington, D.C. is zoned that you can't build higher than the Capitol building. And so we assumed that that city would spread across the Potomac and a vertical city would rise up, clustered it within the range of the precogs, the precognitive beings, and become very vertical. So we developed sort of the infrastructure of the city based on that logic. And with a couple of other things, that Steven Spielberg wanted this city to be benign, this to be an apparently benign future, sort of fossil fuel free, technology actually works. There's a sort of hierarchy that builds in the city. There's a mall city that develops up high, not necessarily dissimilar from where we are now. And then an underbelly of that city that's separated, that it receives less light, and that is the sort of remnant of the old city. So with those components, we moved forward and created a world space with quite a lot of detail, as I'll describe, within which the script found a space. By the time we finished the film and looked back, we realized that the design of the world had preceded the telling of the story, that the world had become a container not just for that single narrative, but for multiple narratives, that we knew that if Tom Cruise turned left instead of right out of a door, we knew exactly what was there in the world. So that we realized that even though this was a linear story that was going to be told in a cinema, that it would have been quite easy to spin off dozens, if not hundreds, of different stories within this world. We saw that the stories, once the world was in place, started emerging logically and organically from the holistic world space. And we also saw that the world building had stimulated the systems that were in place within this world and had triggered a sort of collection of emergent technologies, which began to emerge more and more over the sort of decades since the film released. So this holistic world was capable of giving us multiple stories, as I say, or multiple viewpoints, coexisting domains. We could look at urban planning. We could look at the kind of time and space of the world. We could look at the role of advertising on the individual and the role of the individual within the environment in this consumer space. We could look at data and technology and the ways in which new technology might develop given the conditions of the world. And we could look at, say, a transportation system. So if we were to drill into that, we have our broad horizontal world, the kind of urban planning of this future DC. And then we move from that and start slicing into that world and look at the verticals, the impact on every aspect of the world, whether it's fashion or technology, wearables, or architecture, the greening of the architecture, or transportation system. So taking the vertical, for example, of a transportation system, we were looking at the evolution of the elevator, the sort of idea of moving elevators, trying to create taller buildings by allowing more people to I'm going to forget my tech in this, but what we understood, I think, was that the height of buildings is limited by the number of elevators that it can contain. Is that right, you architects? And that we were combining the idea of elevators and driverless cars. So what if a car could move vertically on the side of a building and then move horizontally to where it would have to go? So now we're in the realm of fiction, which is a valuable component in this storytelling process. But that vertical evolved from that kind of conceptual idea into a pre-visualization of that, rapid prototyping the model, a kind of car with a spit where the wheels would turn independently of each other on a central axis, be pushed out into rapid prototyping, CNC cut molds, fiberglass printing, that same digital model being pushed out into the visual effects, into illustrations. So we sort of had this holistic system for design being distributed across all the different manufacturing processes, but also a way in which the storytellers could engage in this kind of conceptual idea and see what narratives could evolve. So you can see in the top left is the final film. Bottom left, that's the previs. They bear a lot of resemblance to each other because in this case, for the first time, Steven Spielberg directed the previs. So the prototype itself was actually the final design environment. And then the information that was gathered there was distributed out to all the manufacturing parts, and then the final film was put together following that model. But what we really saw significantly was that it would have been impossible to imagine that a script, sort of 120 pages of white paper, typewritten, would have given us a vertical car chase, that it came directly out of the investigation of the world and the way the world evolved. And then the writer came to it, and the director came to it, and decided to pull it into the story. So we realized that the world building was kind of inverting the model. So to break that down, if we start with this origin, the kind of primary rules, the story ideas, we start adding the context to that. So the original disruptor, the precogs, in this case, what I would call the sort of what if and why not, where fiction can become a real stimulant to the way the story evolves. Then what is the context of that? Where are we? When are we? Why are we? What is the climate? You know, what's the climate? What's the terrain? What's the year? Those kind of things that are going to give us a real solid context. If we were on Mars, the conditions are going to be different. The terrain and the weather, the climate are going to change the narrative very differently than if we're in 17th century Paris. So the context is crucial. And then the ecologies that evolve relative to this particular world. So in this, you know, as we were seeing urban planning, the sort of physical, science, engineering, education, mental, social components, the social politics of the world, and then the subdomains, so in this case, the transportation system or fashion or technologies would all fit into different parts of this world. So as I've mentioned before, you have a kind of horizontal and a vertical. The horizontal slice, if you imagine that we're looking through a cross-section of a sphere here of all of the components of any world, these words are really interchangeable depending on what world you're building, but there's a relationship between the systems of the world, the location, the construction or maker component, the culture, the art science, the body and the human in that space. And then we can dive vertically into any one of those areas, and by drilling a kind of core sample out of the world, we make the world more robust by investigating it. And then the last component here is the component of scale. Very often in a world frame, you get to know a lot about the larger context, but it's equally important to be looking at the individual and running the model of any individual character, the people who are actually inhabiting this world, and drilling deeply into the way that the world affects them. What is a day in the life of the individual, how they fit into a community, and how that community is part of a larger population in terms of the character, and then in terms of the environment, the world space, all of the socio-political influence on that, the neighborhood, the architecture of that, and the way that the home functions, for example. And then in the sort of technology side, what we, as we asked these questions of what if and why not, and drilled into the possibilities of the technology through the narrative, what we've discovered is that over 100 patents have been applied to elements of the film that were told in a fictional sense in 2000, 2001. Every year, I think if you check on the web at different times, up to 16 million hits on how Minority Report predicted the future. Now, it wasn't that we were being so clever, it's that the research we were doing, admittedly backed with the name of Steven Spielberg, opening doors to us to labs and to industry and to all sorts of domain experts, was giving us clues to how the future is evolving, and then we could extrapolate forward from that. Again, using this great advantage of fiction, where you can say, where would we want this story to go? And then what do we have to do to get there? And that syncs up when you're looking at future reality rather than science fiction. It really syncs up with how the world is evolving. And more, my practice is about real-world conditions now, because we've seen that this notion of a kind of combination of research and fiction really is a powerful tool for extrapolating forward, not predicting the future, but driving us towards the future we want to arrive in. A couple of other film examples, just in terms of process. Man of Steel. This, for me, as a designer, the design process for me started with the question, why does Superman have an S on his chest? He's from Krypton, they don't speak English. What is that S? You know, so we started diving into that, and we developed a series of glyphs, and we thought it's probably a kind of heraldic symbol, one of many, representing a kind of feudal society, a very hierarchical society of these strong families that have evolved through generations. And then we kind of went a little crazy, and we thought, well, what would happen if you actually turned this into a written language? And in 3 months we evolved a complete written and spoken language of Kryptonian. So if you have your Krypton dictionary with you when you're watching the film, you can translate all of the text that appears on the walls and swords and spaceships, because it was part of that notion of the feudal, that the object was the most important thing in the society, and that actually sort of feeds directly into the narrative. So the objects are all scribed and inscribed with their own names, and in the structure of language, the object actually is more important than the subject. And then we took that form language of the graphic and turned it into, we took the graphic language and turned it into a form language. The notion that there are no straight lines on Krypton, that it had a kind of biological basis to its science, that perhaps a lot of objects were either grown or certainly that was the kind of the motivator for the world. We looked at how that would serve the narrative in terms of, first of all, the origin story. What we have as core narrative in Superman, there's two things that have to happen. One is the world has to be so inward-looking that it doesn't see its own self-destruction. That seems so unlikely. And the other is that a small baby has to find its way from one planetary system to another. So we imagined that this inward-facing society, this feudal, ancient society of leaders, had created a space program, had gone off-world, and then had shut themselves down and turned inward, but left remnants of that behind, and that there was a single scientist, Superman's dad, who holds on to the flame and is able to put his son into this small ship, which, because of its organic form, when it lands on Earth, is hidden in plain sight. Now, as we started scaling into the reality of what we would actually have to build, we had to make some decisions. This completely organic, no straight line form language had to all be created with rapid prototyping, 3D printing. So we tied up all of the 3D printers in the lower mainland of British Columbia for 3 months and printed a lot of stuff. But prototyped it because half of what's happening in film is that it's digital or virtual, and half is real, and where does those lines fall? So you're constantly testing between those spaces. But a great deal of what is represented by the illustration on the left was physically constructed. And then we moved that into the scale of the architecture and combined traditional shipbuilding practices, which is where the construction crews in Vancouver come from, with a lot of CNC cut ribs and complex forms, and then plaster and lath sort of processes with that. So a really interesting combination, I think, and something that we could all make better use of, this kind of blend between traditional and new technology. The last film I'll talk about was a film called The Terminal, also with Steven Spielberg. In this case, we had to come up with an imaginary airport. We found a space for it at JFK. There's just enough room for a new terminal right there between Terminal 4 and 5. Mixed that fictional airport with a piece of Mirabel in Montreal, which was shut down several years ago and that we were able to shoot in. But on the whole, we had to shoot in the location we found. So this is a story of a single individual. It's a metaphoric story, a timeless kind of narrative. It's balancing this ancient story of a single individual who could just as easily have come in from the woods and been surrounded by wolves and sought shelter in a village, and then had to come to terms with the villagers before he could leave. Or in this case, the wolves are sort of security in the airport, and he finds himself in this airport marooned. And we need to follow him as a character through this world.
Please. Please. Please.
So this was a completely constructed environment, largest set ever built, interior. It was skinned on the outside, 360 degrees lighting, big painting outside the window so that it didn't have to be composited later. And then in the interior, 1,000 people a day for 3 months, sort of living in this space with working escalators and marble and a 360-degree steel structure. So we needed to make this set both as small as it could be and as large as it needed to be without rehearsals. Steven Spielberg wanted to treat it as a location, and so we went back and forth a great deal with previs and using prototyping before we actually constructed the environment. And I would say that, it was crucial that the audience believed that they had been in this airport, so we used every cliche of airport architecture, plane wings, overhead luggage compartments, and made this space familiar for the audience so that we had people coming up to us saying they knew where we had shot it. But at the same time, it is not an airport, clearly, and it's not architecture. It's specifically a container for narrative, and as such, it has to fulfill a very different function than architecture would have to. Now, in that notion of a single character driving through the world, or multiple characters driving through the world, this is a project we've been doing for a sports company that looks at the evolution of a character in the real world through ages 9, 16, 19, 24, and then places that character into a relationship with multiple different systems, and then allows us to develop narrative lenses from which stories evolve. In this case, the stories triggered over 300 prototypes just through a kind of deep investigation of the narrative space in the real world, looking 10 years into the future, and with deep research. So the research sort of is the bed for this, and then the narrative evolution from the research is the way in which we can gather all of the participants and engage them in a real world that doesn't yet exist. So around 1990, I was working with MIT as visiting artist on this robot opera, Death and the Powers, and sort of engaged for the first time in a really data-driven narrative. So in this story, Simon Powers, the central character, leaves the stage in the first scene, and then he is strapped into all of these devices that you see being demonstrated by Ellie Jessup here. And for the rest of the duration of the opera, he continues to perform in real time off stage, and his performance is driving all of the components on stage. So his fellow singers are interacting with him through video screens, through robotics, through a giant chandelier, and the measurement of him and the translation of that measurement into sound and light, there's a massive spatialized sound system as well, became fascinating to me. The idea that we can turn data into anything, instead of perhaps this really mundane data translations that we're seeing, say, with the amount of steps you take and the watch you wear telling you how many steps you've taken. What if you translate that into more exotic forms? This was a project for Museum of Modern Art, 2008, Design in the Elastic Mind, working with architect Greg Lynn and designer Peter Frankfurt. The idea here was to take all of the population of the world and place them in a virtual world where there could be the possibility of completely new relationships with their data. So a little old lady could be tending her flowers in the garden of her virtual home, and they could be thriving, flourishing, or dying according to her stocks and shares.
Our understanding of space is changing again. Online social networking has had a huge impact on the way we communicate now. And this is really just the beginning and only scratches the surface of the way we're going to interact with each other, communicate, and experience the world. We decided to think of New City as the entire world. So the world is, for the first time, becoming one connected city with 8 billion addresses, all located in a single virtual destination. It wasn't just about information design and geography, it was about how you'd experience this world. Rethinking what the space of this city would be, we obviously didn't want to work with a flat map. We also didn't want to work with an Earth or a globe. So we rethought New City as a series of manifolds. What we mean when we say manifolds are reconfigurable pieces of geometry that can distort, fold through themselves, and connect in ways that you couldn't connect with a plane or a sheet or a globe. We decided to take each of the continents on the Earth and make each continent one of these manifolds and let these things move and ebb and flow with different kinds of communication and information. What you see when you go to New City is based on what you want to see. It's a series of lenses of information that you can overlay on the space and experience a city in very different ways. From abstract charts and data, you can move seamlessly into three-dimensional space of a city. The most exciting thing about New City is that it's the petri dish for architectural experiments that haven't happened yet in the virtual world. So New City is the first place that kind of architectural investigation happens, and it's a virtual world that's first of all architecturally considered. I can find out what's going on anywhere in the world, and it really collapses that distance that was there 20 years ago.
So I'm fascinated by this project, and we're just about to relaunch it now with the kind of new virtual reality capabilities that we have, to see if we can really think about completely new sorts of stories to inform our world. Now, I also, beyond my design practice, I'm also teaching at USC, and looking at sort of the space within which collaboration can take place. USC is an interesting school because there's 40,000 students. There are many different disciplines being taught. And the World Building Lab is able to reach out to very broadly across the school and gather people from all sorts of different disciplines. So I've got, in my class, I have architects, I've had music students, engineers, film, game, animation, TV, and critical studies and writers. So it's a really great laboratory for seeing how we can reimagine collaboration. Also running a conference called the Science of Fiction, which I'll talk about. So what I'm seeing with the students who come to the class is that they are impatient with the edges, with the silos that surround them. They see the ubiquity of the technologies that are available to them, and they feel constrained within any of these particular silos. And it struck me in the last year or so that what we're teaching now is allowing students to develop semantics and skills for media and for spaces that do not yet have a name. That we're really kind of creating potentially a new breed of art scientists who have enormous flexibility to start to sort of transcend and slice through these silos. And I think design is a really powerful tool for that because it is a common language that allows many of the industries to converge. As an experiment for that, at the beginning of 2014, we decided to invent a city. The city called Ralau was an attempt to prototype vast collaboration and tribal storytelling. So Ralau is an island city, an archipelago. It was formed from the chance meeting of the DNA of Rio and Los Angeles on this island that's too small for its population. That was the entire constraint at the beginning of 2014. We placed it somewhere in the Pacific, and its form evolved and its narratives evolved. We've had architects, we've had scientists, engineers, game makers, VR experiments all being told in this space. This is a terraforming game that's designed to create more land for the overpopulation, robotic drones so that there can be architecture built in inhospitable landscape, vertical favelas, and also a whole kind of narrative that includes propaganda from the original discoverer of the island. The island was found, I think, in 1896, somewhere around there, and in the process of evolving a new fuel source that was threatening world economy, it was shut down coincidentally with a plague that occurred at the same time, disappeared from view in 1926 and reappeared by good fortune at USC in 2014, where a series of a sort of anthropological cabaret unveiled the island for the first time. At that time, we had a lot of different people starting to work in this space. We'd had students working for 2 semesters. This is an architectural student who built an exoskeleton driven by brainwave and by body motion as a way of hiding and displaying in an overpopulated world. These are projects from the Royal College of Art, a political playground, children having to commit very early to which political party they adhere, and an idea that FedEx was dropping packages by mistake on an island that knew nothing about the products that were arriving there. And then finally, in the fall, in October of last year, we ran a one-day world build based on what we knew of Ralau. We had turned into a card-based prompt game and 1,000 stories were evolved, were written by 300 people in 2.5 hours. Those stories were culled down to 250 objects that were created, and the whole thing was uploaded in a day. And so we're really using this world space, this now open source world that has figured in workshops all over the world and has involved 9 different schools so far, in how you can actually, with great facility, engage in really large collaborations. And so we're evolving a museum of Ralau that is absorbing all these narratives and these artifacts that have been built, and will be sort of on permanent display. Another lab project funded by the Academy for Neuroscience and Architecture was looking at ways in which we could measure perception in 3D space. So now engaging Greg Lynn again, and his school, UCLA, that has robots, the Salk Institute, the perception scientist Sergei Gepstein, and our prototyping of the environment at Cinematic Arts, and then doing a series of measuring tests with individual subjects to see if we could discover the sort of edges of perception at different rates of speed and different light intensities, and for the first time mapping that into a three-dimensional space. That starts to, I think, describe ways of reconsidering wayfinding, for example. And then the project that we've been engaged in the last couple of years was built around a request that Intel made to look at the future of narrative. What they had done was go and find the rights to a book called Leviathan, which involved a giant flying whale, a created genetic creature in this children's book. We rewrote the story or wound it back to 1895 and found it to be a fantastic subject because it's a completely self-contained ecosystem. This whale with its passengers, sort of payload of 80 passengers flying from London to Moscow in 1895, provided a possibility of really going deep into what narrative might turn into, given the tools that we have confronted with. And what Intel wanted to see was what chips would they have to build to cater to the complex narratives that were evolving. So we looked at immersive theater actually as our input, less film and less game. This is a play which, if any of you have been to New York, may have seen, called Sleep No More, where the telling of Macbeth takes place simultaneously over 5 different floors. And it's impossible to get a single narrative. You wander freely through the space, and your viewpoint changes the story doesn't change. So we've made that be the sort of driver of this world in virtual reality and in augmented reality. Walking through, changing your viewpoint relative to the world space gives every single participant a completely unique story. Story we've been prototyping that we allow you to be embed into the world as a little flying jellyfish, to experience head tracking, to put your tentacle into somebody's head and listen to you sort of telepathically listen to their inner thoughts, to look at second screen in the world, to fly, to really push at the edges of what VR is capable of at the moment. And then in augmented reality...
Remember I told you this was an immersive event tonight. Tonight, I don't want you to merely imagine a flying whale. I want you to experience it. Sight, sound, all of it.
So the goal of this project was to take sort of augmented reality off the back of serial packets and try and make it into a cinematic experience, or really post-cinematic, transcend the screen. It was an interesting experiment because there was no hardware involved. No one was wearing anything, no one had any tablets, yet the whale was in their space. It was only there at the moment that it was there, and that they were there. You could see them reaching for it. And we realized, though, it's pure smoke and mirrors, but that we had got the most engagement out of an audience that we've ever had with mixed reality without any of the hardware devices. Al-Baida is a project we've been working on also for a couple of years. This is a village in Saudi, south of Mecca. It's a Bedouin tribe that was settled in an oasis and whose animals grazed and whose wood the wood was cut to the point that there was nothing left for the animals to graze on. So deforestation has put this tribe into really abject poverty, and a foundation was formed to create a new village. Our job was not design, but to create the opportunity for the tribe, for the culture to see a vision of what could be in order to invest their sweat equity in building the village for themselves. But also to tap deeply into the cultural conditions of the world and combine that with the technologies that we had, so that there was a basic truth and honesty to the development of this culture that would support the Bedouin tribe and the culture that they wanted to maintain, but allow this project to move forward. It involves both sustainable architecture and sustainable agriculture.
Al-Baida is an area about 40 kilometers southeast of Mecca. It has 3,000 settled inhabitants. These people are remote from a city. They have no access to basic services. So then you start to see the same things that you see around the world when societies become impoverished. Part of poverty is being reliant on someone. One of the foundational beliefs at Al-Baida is that all of the work that happens has to come from the population itself. As soon as we started asking them to build, one of the challenges that we had was most of them cannot be considered literate in our own language. We had to rely on a common language, and for us it was the language of pictures and symbols. We started to come up with this idea of using the virtual space to solve real-world problems. It was a real-time space where you could see the world that you've created on these screens and be able to turn them and expand them and collapse them and rotate them and move walls in minutes.
So in this case, we're using game technology to move between narrative, interaction, and diagrammatic, sort of to show how the sustainable systems work, the water from daily prayers, cooling down the interior, and then moving through that into a narrative that allows the audience to understand, the tribe themselves to see the way in which the world could evolve. So there's a single building standing right now, but 300 are planned. So what will this future look like is a level of engagement that is not only crucial to the tribe, but also to the authorities. So they have been trying to get land use planning permission to build this village for 5 years. This visualization went to the local governor and he granted land use right away. So that power of being able to create an immersive visualization of something that does not yet exist, that prototyping with narrative fed through it is obviously incredibly powerful. This is showing the sustainable system dams that are now being built up in the mountains that are trapping the water. It rained once 5 years ago, it just rained again, but in 5 years there has been a full growth in this area for the first time, instead of this water being run off into flash floods. So the sustainable agriculture is already very much in place and working, but this allows the villagers to sort of understand exactly what's happening. Right now, we're moving into a literacy program, building a combination of augmented reality and virtual reality for a sort of re-examination of how literacy might be introduced into a tribe that is mostly illiterate, and giving them the tools to learn, and also just to develop, sort of push that cultural literacy back into the world. And finally, this is a project we're doing with Mission Blue, Sylvia Earle. It's a project around the oceans. She developed 5 years ago the idea of hope spots, that around the world there are areas of the ocean that, as volumes, are in trouble but can be saved. But they're incredibly hard to visualize. The people, we generally see the surface of the ocean and don't understand the degree of destruction or problems that are occurring below water, below the surface, and acidification, pollution. And so this is using virtual reality and using it to pull together the sort of art and the science of possibilities. So this is a combination of Mission Blue, Autodesk, 5D. We're also working with BBC, and a game company called Eline Media, and developing a virtual reality part of this so that you could dive into the world and literally immerse yourself. So that the ocean expands around you. You find yourself, having seen the scale of the hope spot, that you are now fully immersed in it at full scale. You have a time light where you can move through this virtual world and see the before and after of it. So we're really using these tools to do things that are impossible to do in any other way. And then to dive down into the depths and to see bioluminescence and change one's scale relative to the creatures in the deep. This is developing into sort of a combination of the processes that I've been describing, where research, ideation, iteration moves into this narrative space. We're looking at the scale of the entire ecosystem, the individual, the collective engagement of the community, and the broad educational possibilities, ways in which we can step inside this world through narrative design visualization and prototyping, develop the narratives, and then to push them out across all media, sort of push them in the BBC film, mixed reality and immersive virtual reality, consumer game, and then into the education space, and to use this as a space that scientists can come to push data into it, and to develop a direct relationship between areas in the real world and the virtual world, mapped directly to each other through data visualization. Thank you. Is it?
seconds.